Okay, so this is going to be for the back of the notes. Okay, so the front we did increasing, decreasing, constant intervals, and now we're going to do something called extrema. Okay, and extrema are the extreme values of a graph. Okay, and really what that means is that they're maximums or minimums. And we usually think of maximum as being the highest and minimum being the lowest, and that is still true, but you can see here we have different terms. We have relative and we have absolute, and they're different from one another. And one thing you need to know is that not all graphs will have extrema. If you think of a line is not going to have any kind of extrema at all. Okay, and you'll see what I mean after we come up with the definitions for these. So relative maximums and minimums. So you know what? No, let's start with absolute because they're a little bit simpler. So an absolute minimum is the very lowest point on a graph. Okay, so like I was talking about the line doesn't have a lowest point. It keeps going down forever, so it would not have an absolute minimum. And then an absolute maximum would then be the highest point on a graph. Again, sometimes you will have a highest point, sometimes you won't, but notice that it does say point. So that does mean for all of these, we are going to be doing ordered pairs. So point, just remember we're going to be doing x, y values for all of these. Okay. So now relative. Relative means that it is where a graph changes from decreasing to increasing. So think about a parabola. If it is decreasing and then it changes to increasing, that point down here is going to be a relative minimum. So you want to think about relative minimums as being valleys. We talk about peaks and valleys or hills and valleys. All relative minimums are going to be valleys. Now, a relative maximum is where a graph changes from increasing, oh, that's not the right spelling, increasing to decreasing. Okay, so it's just the opposite of a relative minimum. So now it's changing from increasing to decreasing. So this point here would be a relative maximum. Okay, now, can one point be both? Yes, that is true. Points can be both relative and absolute. And you'll see what I mean when we get into the examples. But points don't have to be both. They could be one, they could be other, they could be nothing. Okay, so just remember our definitions when we start to go through these examples. Okay, so let's start again with the absolutes, because absolutes I think are a little bit simpler. So the absolute highest point on this graph, there isn't one. Okay, there is no point that is going to be the highest because my arrows go on forever. So it's just going to keep going up and up and up and up. So there is no absolute maximum. The absolute minimum, however, is going to be the lowest point on the graph, which is this point right here. Now remember, we're doing ordered pairs. So that's going to be -4, -2. Okay, so highest point, lowest point. Now for the relatives, I'm looking at peaks and valleys. So my relative maximum is going to be right here, where my graph changes from increasing to decreasing. So that's the point 0, 2. There is no other place that has that where it changes from increasing to decreasing, so that's the only one. Now, relative minimums, there's actually 2. This point and this point. Both of them change from decreasing to increasing. So we have the point 3, 0, and we have the point -4, -2 again. So -4, -2 is both a relative minimum and an absolute minimum. Okay, and sometimes you'll hear the absolutes be called global maximum and global minimums. And sometimes you'll hear the relatives be called local. So local maxes and mins versus global maxes and mins. So if you go on Khan Academy or something like that, you might hear those other terms. But for our class, we're always going to use absolute and relative. Okay. So for these, if you want to pause the video, try them on your own, you certainly can, or you can just keep following along. Okay, so for this next one, notice that there's no arrows. If there's no arrows, then I have to have absolutes. Okay, that means that there has to be a highest and lowest point. The only way you're not going to get a highest and lowest point is if there's arrows, because they go on forever. So my absolute maximum is going to be my highest point. So that's going to be up here. And that looks to be at -5, 9. My absolute minimum is down here. It's my lowest point, and that's going to be 3, 1. Okay. So now my relatives. Looks like I only have 1 up here. That's where the graph is changing from increasing to decreasing. So that's going to be a relative max. And there's going to be no relative minimums. Now, if you have endpoints like this, yes, it's decreasing, but it doesn't change to increasing. That's why it can't be relative, because that change doesn't happen. The change is what makes it relative. So if there's no change, then they can't be relative. So if you have endpoints of a graph, those endpoints can never be relative. Endpoints can only be absolute. Okay, now for my next one, I see we have arrows this time. So that means there is no absolute minimum. But there is an absolute maximum. It's right there. And that's going to be at the point 4, 3. And that's my absolutely highest point. Now for my relatives. I have no relative minimums again. But 4, 3 is again my relative maximum because it changes from increasing to decreasing. Okay. So sometimes graphs will have no extrema at all. Sometimes graphs will have all 4. You can have a graph that has all 4 absolute and relative maxes and mins. Okay, so now this last one just kind of summarizes everything, the front and the back, the increasing, decreasing, constant. Now, the biggest, trickiest part, I guess, everything that everybody always gets trips up on, is that all of your answers here are going to look the same, but they are represented differently. You have to remember that, oh, and that's going to go off my page. We'll write it up here, that this is interval notation. So you're using x values only. Okay, so for these 3, when you're doing intervals, you have to remember it's only x values. These down here are ordered pairs. So these are going to be in the form xy. So while they're going to look the same, as in they're both going to be parentheses with 2 numbers, they mean different things. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind when you're doing this. So let's see, it's increasing just in this little piece here. That's the only piece where it's going uphill. So that's going to be from -6 to -3. and then it's decreasing here and here. So that's going to be from -8 to -6, and then again from -3 to infinity. Again, those are left to right intervals using only x values. And there's nothing that's constant. There's no horizontal. Now, my absolute maximums and minimums. Okay, there is no absolute minimum because it goes down forever. But there is an absolute maximum. This point here is my highest point. So that's the point -8, -3. Now, relatives, I actually do have one of each. And let's use orange. Okay, so this is a relative minimum because I can even see I put it in red and blue. It's changing from decreasing to increasing. So that point there is a relative minimum. So that's going to be the point -6, -6. And then relative maximum, that's going to be my hill. So that's going to be -3, -4. Okay. So again, I understand that these answers look the same, but you need to realize that this -8 to -6 is just x values. That's saying -8 to -6. Between those two values, x values, the graph is decreasing. That's what that one says. This one is an actual point. This is saying there is a relative maximum at that specific place right there, -3 to -4. So your homework is going to be a worksheet that I've put on the classroom, and it's going to have all different graphs, and you just have to do exactly what we did here. You're going to write down all the increasing, decreasing, and constant intervals, and then write down all of your extrema. Okay, so just remember, again, these are interval notation with x's only. These are ordered pairs, x, y's. Okay? If you have any questions, you can join office hours or email me or rewatch these videos. Whatever you need, just let me know.